Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're going somewhere I've wanted to cover for a long time, the Appalachian Mountains. Now, if you've never been, let me give you a quick picture of what we're dealing with. The Appalachians are one of the oldest mountain ranges on the planet. We're talking hundreds of millions of years old. The forests up there are dense and ancient, the kind of woods where the canopy is so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground in summer. People have lived in those mountains for generations, deep in the hollows, up on the ridges, in places where the nearest neighbor is 5 miles away through trees. And over those generations, they've carried stories. Stories that get passed down through families. Stories about things in the forest that don't follow any rules that make sense. Things that watch, things that follow, things that have been out there far longer than any of us. Tonight, I have 3 of those stories. All 3 were submitted to me by real people who say these experiences happened to them personally, in those mountains, in those woods. As always, I'll let you decide what to make of them. So, get comfortable. Turn down the lights if you want, and let's get into it. Story 1. What followed Cole down the mountain. Cole Merritt had been hiking solo for going on 3 years when he decided to tackle a remote section of the Appalachian Trail in western North Carolina. He wasn't inexperienced. That's the first thing he wanted me to make clear when he sent me this story. He'd camped alone in November sleet, crossed flooded creek beds before sunrise, pushed 30-mile days on rough terrain. The backcountry was where Cole went to decompress, to feel like a human being again after long months of desk work and city noise. He loved those mountains. He trusted them. He's told me since that he'll never look at them the same way again. The section he chose was beautiful in the kind of way that makes you feel genuinely small. Deep, old-growth forest, ridgelines wrapped in morning fog, the kind of wilderness where you can go a full day without seeing another person. Cole had been reading about it in hiking journals for months. Late October seemed like perfect timing. The leaves would be at peak color, the summer crowds would be long gone, and the temperatures would be cold enough to keep the bugs down. He packed a 5-day bag, kissed his wife goodbye, and set out from a small trailhead off a county road on a Tuesday morning. The first day went exactly right. The leaves were doing their thing, amber and copper and deep burning red in every direction, and the temperature was cool enough that he could see his breath in the first hour. He covered 12 miles without pushing himself, found his backcountry campsite near a small stream, and had everything set up well before dark. He cooked, filtered water, crawled into a sleeping bag, and was out by 9. He felt the specific, earned satisfaction that only comes from a hard physical day in a beautiful place. He had 4 more of it ahead of him. He fell asleep fast. He woke at 2 in the morning to a sound he couldn't place. It was outside the tent, low, slow, rhythmic. Not sharp, not a sudden crack of a branch or a scramble of small feet on leaves. This was sustained and measured, cycling over and over in a pattern that his half-asleep brain took several seconds to identify. His first instinct was wind moving through the canopy, but the leaves weren't moving. There was no wind. What it sounded like, what it kept sounding like, no matter how many times he tried to find a better explanation, was breathing. Long, deep inhalations followed by slow, full exhalations. The respiratory cycle of something very large standing just outside the thin nylon wall of his tent. Cole reached for his knife, reached for his headlamp. He lay without moving and controlled his breathing and listened. The sound continued, completely indifferent to whether he was awake or not, patient and slow and even, like whatever was out there had nowhere to be and nothing to prove. He told himself bear. Bears were common in that section of trail. He told himself a large animal could produce a sound like that. He told himself there was a reasonable explanation for every reasonable-sounding thing in the forest at night. The breathing went on for what he'd later estimate was close to 20 minutes. Then it stopped. He heard something move away through the leaves, slow, heavy steps retreating into the trees, and then the normal sounds of the night came back. Crickets, the creek. He lay awake until sunrise. The morning before he broke camp, he walked the perimeter. He was looking. He hadn't decided to look. His body had decided on its own. the way your body sometimes makes decisions before your brain catches up. He found the tracks in a soft patch of bare soil on the uphill side of his tent, in a gap between two exposed roots where the earth was dark and wet. They were not animal tracks, not the wide clawed press of a bear paw, not the divided split of deer hooves, not the delicate scatter of raccoon or fox. These were upright tracks, bipedal, a defined heel, a wide forefoot, the clear impression of toes spread in the soil, and they were enormous. Cole set his own boot next to one of them, for comparison, pressing his sole into the ground beside it, and the unknown track was nearly twice the length of his. The depth of the impression told me the thing that made it was carrying serious weight. He followed the pattern. The tracks circled his tent in slow, deliberate orbits, each pass coming a little closer than the last, stopping at a spot about 3 feet from the tent wall. Cole crouched at that stopping point for a long time and looked at the ground. A broken branch lay in the leaves right there. He photographed everything, all of it, then packed his camp and started walking. He spent most of that second day trying to work it out rationally. Maybe a local was playing some kind of elaborate joke. Maybe there was a wildlife explanation he just hadn't encountered before. But every time he built an argument that felt stable, it fell apart when he actually stacked it against what he'd seen with his own eyes. And eventually he stopped trying to explain and just started watching. And that's when the feeling started. That cold directional pressure between the shoulder blades, the deep animal certainty that something behind you has found you and will not look away. He'd had flashes of it before in exposed sections of trail. This was unbroken, sustained, and pointed. Something was moving parallel to him through the trees to his right, pacing him, watching him move down the trail. He could feel which direction it was coming from without looking. He made camp before he wanted to, that second night, at a flat stretch above a creek. He built a fire, even though the temperature didn't call for it, and sat in front of it long after dark, feeding in sticks and staring at the tree line past the firelight. The forest had gone quiet in a way that felt wrong. No insects, no rustling for small animals in the underbrush, the creek sounding oddly far away and flat. The silence had pressure to it. He put out the fire just before 10, climbed into his tent, and lay in the dark with the knife in his hand, and waited. It came back, just after midnight. The breathing first, closer than the night before, and different in quality, wetter now, heavier, like the air was moving through passages that were too large to picture. It circled the tent in the same slow pattern, and then it changed. It started making noise that wasn't breathing, long, low tones moving up and down through a range and a pattern that had an unmistakable structure, not random, not animal, like language that had never been written down. It rose into something that sounded like a statement, then dropped into something that sounded like an answer, and it cycled through that call and response over and over, as if it was working through a sequence that meant something to whatever was producing it. Cole pressed himself against the far wall of the tent and held the knife in both hands. His vision had gone strange from adrenaline. He couldn't swallow. Then the tent wall pushed inward, slowly, deliberately, 6 inches of nylon collapsing toward him under firm, sustained, even pressure. Not a swipe, not a slash, but a press, like a hand testing resistance, exploring it. The fabric stretched toward him for 5 full seconds, then withdrew. He heard the ground take weight, heard it move off through the leaves at a pace that had no urgency whatsoever, unhurried as a person walking home at the end of a long day. Then the creek, then the insects, then nothing. Cole had his tent down and was moving before first light. He jogged sections of trail that should have been walked. When he hit a Forest Service road 3 hours later and found 1 bar of signal on his phone, he called his wife and told her he was done. She asked if something had happened. He said he'd explain when he got home. He still hasn't fully explained it. The photos of those tracks are still on his phone. He's looked at them hundreds of times since, rotating them, zooming in, sending them to people who've never given him an answer that stuck. Something twice his size walked deliberate circles around his camp in the dark. Something that moved on 2 legs.
something that put his hand through the fabric of his tent and held it there, close enough to feel his body heat on the other side. Cole hasn't done a solo hike since. He told me he doesn't think he ever will.
Story 2. What Derek Brought Back. Leanne Hargrove was not a superstitious person. She grew up in Northern Virginia, had a practical, grounded way of looking at the world, and would have told you before any of this happened that she didn't believe in things that didn't make rational sense. She was a third-grade teacher. She was sensible. She just needed to tell someone what she found in those woods and what she thinks happened to her boyfriend in the hour and a half he was missing. The cabin was Derek's idea. He'd found it on a rental site, a property out in Highland County, Virginia, tucked deep in the western Appalachians, where the roads get narrow and then get narrower and then become dirt. The listing described it as rustic with mountain views, which Leanne had correctly predicted meant the heating was inconsistent and there were no neighbors for 2 miles in any direction. Derek thought that was the whole point. He wanted a real week off. No city noise, no obligations, just fireplace and forest and fresh air. They loaded up his truck on a Friday afternoon in early November and made the drive west into the mountains. They arrived after dark, unloaded the car by flashlight, and spent the first night eating leftover takeout by a crackling fire. The cabin was drafty but warm enough, the kind of place that had clearly been in the same family for generations before someone turned it into a rental. Old furniture, faded curtains, a wood stove that needed coaxing but eventually gave good heat. Leanne sat up reading long after Derek went to bed and listened to the wind work its way through the gaps in the window frames. She felt fine. She slept fine. She didn't feel anything wrong yet. The old man appeared on Saturday morning. She was on the porch with her first cup of coffee, watching morning light hit the ridge above the tree line when she noticed him. He was standing at the far edge of the property, right where the mowed grass gave way to the tree line, maybe 40 yards from where she was sitting. Dark clothes, completely still, watching the cabin. She assumed hunter at first, this was prime deer country, and went back inside and mentioned it to Derek, who said exactly what she'd expected him to say. Probably just a local. People out here walk their land. He was there again that afternoon. Same tree line, slightly different position. Leanne walked toward him from the porch to say hello, just to introduce herself, ask if they were on his property, and he turned and walked back into the trees before she'd covered half the distance. She stood at the edge of the yard and watched the forest where he'd disappeared and felt, for the first time, that low, cold feeling in the back of her chest that she couldn't talk herself out of. On Sunday morning, he knocked on the door. 3 slow, measured knocks. Leanne answered and found him standing at the bottom of the porch steps looking up at her. He was old, 70 at least, maybe older, with a deeply weathered face and eyes that were a pale, clear blue, completely steady. He introduced himself as the owner of the property down the road. He spoke quietly and without preamble, and what he said was this: "Don't go into the woods after dark. If the lights in the cabin flickered for more than a few seconds, get in the car and drive to the main road. And he said this last part looking at her with those calm, pale eyes without blinking, that either of them ever heard knocking from inside the walls of the house, they needed to leave immediately, that night, without waiting." He said all of it in the same flat, matter-of-fact tone you'd use to explain where the fuse box was. Derek found it entertaining. He laughed about it over dinner, did a gentle impression of the old man, and told Leanne she shouldn't give it another thought. She didn't find it funny. She lay awake that night listening to the cabin settle and creak in the cold, cataloging every sound, and it was a long time before she finally convinced herself to close her eyes. Monday morning, Derek decided to go for a hike. He had a trail map he'd downloaded before they lost signal, a section of public land that stretched up into the ridge above the cabin. He told Leanne he'd be back by 3 at the latest. She told him to take his charged phone even if he didn't have service. He kissed her and headed out the back door into the trees. At 3 o'clock, she looked up from her book and he wasn't back. At 4, she walked to the edge of the yard and called his name into the forest. At 5, with the November light dropping fast, she started to feel something much worse than uneasy. She tried his phone. Voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. She had barely any signal herself, not enough to call the county emergency line with any confidence the call would connect. She stood in the failing light on that back porch and made herself think clearly.
She grabbed her own headlamp, her phone, and a charged battery pack and walked to the trail entrance at the back of the property. She found his backpack quarter-mile in. It was sitting in the middle of the trail, upright, both shoulder straps unclipped, like it had been set down carefully and with intention. His water bottle was still clipped to the side loop. His headlamp, which he should have had on him, was inside the top compartment, switched off. Leanne stood over it and shone her light into the trees on both sides of the trail and called his name and heard nothing back. Then her light caught something off the trail to the left, a pale color in the dark. She moved toward it through the underbrush and stopped when she saw what it was. A structure, built from interwoven branches and deer bones lashed together with strips of what looked like cloth and vine, rising into a rough dome shape about 4 feet high. The ground around it was pressed completely flat and dark with age and use. The inside was lined with dry leaves and more strips of cloth, and what looked, when she forced herself to look directly at it, like clumps of dark hair. The whole thing sat in the gap between 2 large oaks, as if it had grown there, as if it had been there for a long time. She stood looking at it for 30 or 40 seconds, and then Derek called her name. His voice came from up the trail, maybe 50 feet ahead, completely normal in tone. She found him walking towards her in the dark, unhurt, carrying nothing. She asked what happened. He said he got turned around and sat down to wait for the light to change. She showed him the structure with her headlamp beam. He looked at it for a moment and said he didn't know what it was. That was all he said about it, ever. For the rest of the week, he refused to sit facing windows after dark. He wouldn't go back outside, not even to the porch. He slept with every light in the cabin burning. She asked him on 3 separate occasions what happened in those woods between the time he left the trail and the time she found him, and each time he said the same thing, that he got turned around, sat down, and waited. His voice was steady every time he said it. His face was completely unreadable. She stopped asking. On the last morning, as they loaded the car to leave, Leanne looked down the road toward the old man's property. He was standing in his front yard, too far to make out his expression, watching them. When they finally pulled out of the driveway, he was still standing there. She thinks about that bone and branch structure constantly, about how old it looked, about the hair inside it, about the fact that whatever built it chose a spot 15 feet off a trail that people walked. She thinks about Derek's face when he looked at it, that flat, distant look that was somehow worse than fear would have been. And she thinks about the hour and a half he spent alone in those trees, in the dark, and whatever happened there that he will not talk about, not to her, not to this day. She believes something found him. She believes that with complete certainty. She just can't decide whether the harder part is that it let him go, or whatever it is, it kept.
Story 3. The Knocking at Harlow Ridge. Emmett Bales hadn't been back to his grandfather's property in almost 10 years when he finally made the drive out to eastern Kentucky to deal with the estate. His grandfather, a man named Roy, had passed in September at 84 and left behind a house on 50 acres of wooded ridgeland in a part of the county that still didn't have reliable cell service. Emmett was the closest family member left, which made him the one responsible for clearing the place out and getting it ready to sell. He'd been putting it off. He knew that. His grandfather had spent the last several years of his life behaving strangely, refusing visitors, boarding up the lower windows of the house, pulling the well pump inside and refusing to explain why. Family members who'd gone to check on him came back with stories that were hard to make sense of. Roy had sealed the crawlspace access with 3 layers of material, plywood, then poured concrete, then sheet metal screwed into the joists. He dragged heavy furniture over every floor vent, and in the last year of his life, he hadn't slept on the ground floor at all, moving his entire living arrangement, bed, clothes, food stores, to the 2nd floor and locking the staircase door behind him every night. The family had chalked it up to age, to isolation, to an old man losing his grip on things. Emmett had mostly agreed with that assessment. He agreed with it right up until the moment he pulled his truck into that gravel driveway and walked up to the front door and heard from somewhere beneath his feet a slow and rhythmic knock. He stopped with his hand on the door handle and listened. 1 knock, a pause. Another knock, a longer pause, then another, like something marking time. He stood there on the porch for almost a full minute before he pushed the door open and went inside, telling himself it was the foundation settling or pipes contracting in the cold. The house was dim and smelled of dust and old wood and something underneath that he couldn't name. He went through the rooms slowly. The furniture was still there, everything exactly where his grandfather had left it. On the second floor, the bedroom was stripped but intact. Bare mattress, a stack of canned goods in the closet, a battery-powered radio on the windowsill. His grandfather had been living up here like a man waiting something out. He didn't hear the knocking again that first evening. He slept in his truck. The next morning, a man named Gerald, who farmed the land adjoining the property, came by on a four-wheeler. He was in his mid-60s, barrel-chested, the kind of slow-moving and unhurried person who had grown up with the land under his feet and trusted it completely. He got off the four-wheeler and shook Emmett's hand and said he was sorry about Roy. Then he looked at the house for a moment and said something that Emmett has repeated word for word every time he's told this story since. He said, "Your granddaddy sealed this place for a reason, and I'd leave it sealed if I was you." Emmett asked him what he meant. Gerald looked at the tree line past the house for a moment before he answered. He said that Roy had started hearing things under the house about 12 years back, that Roy had gone down into the crawl space himself to see what it was and come back up changed. Wouldn't say what he found, wouldn't let Gerald see, sealed the access point within a week and never opened it again. Gerald said he'd asked Roy about it once directly, and Roy had looked at him with a steadiness that made Gerald sorry he'd asked, and said only that some things that live in the ground have been living there longer than the people above them, and the best thing to do is leave them alone. Gerald left shortly after that. Emmett stood in the yard and looked at the house. He should have left it alone. He knows that. He's said it himself every time he's talked about this since. But he was there to clear the property for sale, and a buyer was going to need to know what was under the house, and so he went inside and found the access point in the hallway closet and began removing what Roy had put over it. The plywood came up with a pry bar. The sheet metal took longer. The concrete was only an inch thick, poured over the metal, not anchored to anything, and he broke it up with a hammer and chisel and pulled the pieces away. He got the access hatch open in about 2 hours of work. He clicked on his flashlight and shone it down into the crawl space and held it there. The ground under the house had been disturbed across the entire span of the foundation, not dug up, but pressed and worked and moved in patterns that didn't correspond to anything structural. There were channels worn in the dirt, shallow troughs that ran from one side of the foundation to the other in lines that followed the floor joists above. Bones were scattered through the space. Animal bones, small and medium-sized, some of them cracked and older than others. In the far corner, under the back bedroom, something had assembled a layered bed of leaves and bark and fur that was several inches thick and roughly the dimensions of a large person. It was not old. The fur on top of it was still soft. The depression in it was fresh. And then the knocking started. One knock from the darkness at the far end of the crawl space, beneath the back bedroom. A pause, then another, closer. Something was moving towards the hatch in the dark, moving slowly, dragging something, making that deliberate rhythmic sound with each movement through the soil. Emmett did not reach for his flashlight to look further in. He stood up and walked very quickly to the front door and out to his truck, and he drove to the county road and he sat there for 20 minutes before he could make himself think clearly enough to pull back onto the highway. He called a contractor that afternoon and arranged for the hatch to be resealed. He didn't go back to watch it happen. He handled the rest of the estate sale by phone and email, and the property sold 8 months later to a buyer who he did not inform about any of this. He tells himself the contractor sealed it properly. He tells himself whatever was down there stayed down there. He tells himself that because of what happened that night in the motel. He'd booked a room in a town 12 miles from the property, a clean, ordinary motel on the main road, ground floor room, parking lot right outside the window. He lay in the dark that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the day. He'd left the TV on low for company. His phone was on the nightstand, charging. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, he heard it. One knock from directly beneath his bed.
A pause, another knock, a longer pause, then a third, like something marking its location in the dark beneath him, moving in that same slow, deliberate rhythm he'd heard under the floorboards of the house on the ridge. He turned the lights on. He lay in that bed with every light in the room burning and the TV at full volume until sunrise. He checked out the moment the front desk opened. He has not been back to that part of Kentucky since. Roy sealed that crawl space for a reason. Roy lived on the second floor and locked the staircase door every night for the last years of his life. Roy never explained what he found down there, because, Emmett thinks, once you've looked at it, there's nothing to say that prepares anyone else for looking at it themselves. Whatever was under that house had been there a long time, long enough to press permanent channels into the ground, long enough to gather and arrange, long enough to watch the family living above it go through generations of life while it stayed down there in the dark, patient and completely undisturbed, until Emmett opened the hatch. He doesn't know if the knocking in the motel was real or if his mind had finally cracked under the weight of a very bad day. He goes back and forth on that. But he left every light on, all night, just in case. All right, guys, those are you 3 stories for tonight. I want to say thank you to the people who sent these in. Cole, Leanne, whatever you want to call them. They shared something that clearly still costs them something to talk about. And I think they shared it because they needed someone else to know. Because a story that size doesn't sit quietly inside one person forever. The Appalachian Mountains are stunning. They really are. But they are also old in a way that very few places left in this country still are. Old forests, old hollows. Things that have been in those hills long before any of us started building houses and naming roads. Whatever the people in these stories encountered out there, I don't know what it was. I don't think they do either. And I think that uncertainty, more than anything, is what keeps them up at night. If you've had an experience of your own in the mountains or anywhere else, you know where to find me. I read everything you send. If you enjoyed tonight's video, hit the like button, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one. Sleep well.